Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today for our professional development workshop, How to Apply Organization Development Principles to Address the Challenges Presented by COVID-19 and Social Unrest in the last 2 years. The Chamber is very grateful to provide these offerings free of charge to our Chamber members because of the generosity of our sponsor, the College of St. Scholastica, Stender School of Leadership, Business, and Professional Studies. So before I go ahead and introduce our speaker, I'd like to invite the Dean of Strategic Development at the college, Rick Revore, to provide a few remarks on behalf of their sponsorship. Thanks for joining us, Rick.
Yep. Well, thank you, Chris. The college, we'd like to thank the Chamber team for offering this series, and the Stender School is delighted to sponsor it. A quick update on the College of St. Scholastica. We're excited next month in May, we're breaking ground on our new student center that we're building on campus. That'll be attached to the Mitchell Auditorium. Also, we're enrolling students for our fall start for our MBA in Leadership and Change program, and also for our new Master's in Healthcare Administration degree. If you have any questions on these programs, please let me or Bob know. Finally, thanks to Bob Hartl for presenting today. Bob is a mentor to me and to many others in our community. He founded our MBA in Leadership and Change program, and he's an international expert in organization development. In addition to teaching at St. Scholastica, he consults for a wide variety of organizations. Bob, thanks for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you so much, Rick. And Bob, thanks again. That was a fantastic introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. But as we go throughout this session, we want to encourage your participation. We'll keep the discussion going, and then there will be time at the end for some Q&A. So without further ado, I'm pleased to have Bob Hartl here, Associate Professor of Management at the college, and as Rick said, a whole bunch of other wonderful things, the founder of the MBA in Leadership and Change and a consultant for businesses. So we're happy to have your expertise here, sharing your time and your talents with us. So please take it away.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Rick, for that kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen right away, but let me give you a little heads up about what I have in mind. Depending on numbers and how quickly I move through the material, I may put you in groups a little bit later on, in small groups, to discuss one of the issues that is part of the presentation. But I have to watch my clock carefully. My wife, Kathy, often says I'm the only person she knows who, in giving a movie review, takes longer to give the review than it takes to watch the movie. So I'll be, and Chris, if I'm pushing the time clock, don't hesitate to jump in and let me know about that.
That sounds perfect. Maybe I'll give you a heads up at 1:45.
That sounds good. We want to leave a little bit of time for questions if there are some. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll work our way through the slides I have, and then hopefully we'll have questions and comments later. So the topic is really about as Rick mentioned, the practice or discipline that I've been working on since 1987. It's called organization development. And in particular, today's presentation is about how we can use those principles to deal with some of the challenges that emerged during COVID-19 and also in the social unrest that we experienced in the past couple of years. So that's what we'll be trying to do. So let me begin with definitions. What exactly is organization development? And it's been defined in a variety of ways over the years. The person who is given credit for naming the practice, Dick Beckard, back actually in 1959. This comes from one of the books that he had written in the 60s. He said, it's an effort that is planned, organization-wide, and managed from the top to increase the effectiveness of the organization and its health through planned interventions in the processes. And it's based on behavioral science, on data. This is another one from some guy named Hartl. Oh, wait a second, that's me. Back in 1987, which was the year that I started my consulting work. It is a planned process by which an organization utilizes its resources to bring about controlled change for the purpose of improving its service or product. And a more recent explanation or definition comes from one of my colleagues, Jervis Bush, up at the Beatty School of Business in Vancouver. He says, OD is about creating great teams and organizations. And the form that we talk about in terms of organization development has evolved largely through the thinking of Jervis Bush. So when I learned about organization development back in the 80s, the early 1980s, this is what the model of OD looked like. When you hired a consultant to help your organization with an organization development intervention, there would be a stage of scouting at the beginning of the relationship where the consultant would try to figure out if that person felt they were a good match for the organization, and also put themselves in the position for the organization to see how they behaved, what their models were, how they interacted with people in the organization. Assuming there was a match, the second part of the process would be entry. Entry means a couple of different things. Primarily, it means entering a contract or an agreement, at least a psychological agreement, for what was going to be performed during the OD consultancy. From my perspective, it also means where do you enter the organization? You enter with senior leadership, you enter with the management group, do you enter with people at the bottom of the organization, or do you have to enter at all of those different levels? The next phase, assuming that we go forward with the relationship, was about data collection. And it was a very principled form of gathering data, maintaining anonymity of the people who provided it, recognizing that they are the owners of the data. The facilitators, the consultants, or the management people who were trying to apply these principles back then were very conscious of those issues as being important in terms of maintaining trust with the people with whom you're working. The next phase would be data feedback, where the information that was obtained would be fed back to the people who provided it. And in that way, they would all see what everybody in the organization thought about whatever the issue was that you were dealing with. Usually problem-based, but not always. Some clients who are familiar with OD recognize it's a way of making improvements over what you may be doing quite well today. So there was always a range of business clients. Some of them were interested in improving what they were currently doing. I would say the vast majority of people who called looking for consultants were trying to address particular challenges in their organizations. Then the practitioner would help the group diagnose what the issues were based on the feedback and would help the organization analyze it. The organization development practitioner doesn't work as an expert consultant. They work more as a facilitator, trying to help the group identify what the issues are and figure out what to do about them. The next phase is creating an action plan. Who's going to do what? When does it need to be done? How are we going to evaluate? And then implement whatever the plans were. And last, evaluate. So that was the traditional OD model that was taught back in the 70s and 80s in college-based programs around the country. And this is one example of it, but it's a very typical example of an OD model that was used back then. However, my thinking about organization development has changed a lot since then, mostly during the past 15 years. So I have a revised definition. The way I view it now is that OD is a learning process by which the organization uses its resources to bring about change for the purpose of improving its service or product. And you'll notice the words that have been lined out. In the early days, OD was a carefully planned process. And nowadays, there's less planning that goes into it because it's not always clear what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Sometimes that emerges during the course of the process. And the second word that's crossed out is control, because exerting control in today's environment is virtually impossible. So I look at it as an evolutionary kind of process that starts with a call from a client, and from that point on, it kind of unfolds, and it doesn't always go in a predictable direction. So this definition, though, this change in definition, kind of reflects an evolution in practice that has been going on, for as long as organization development has existed. It was named, though, in 2014 by my friend Jervis Bush and Bob Marshak, another acquaintance of mine, where there was a split from traditional organization development into two different mindsets. The original version, the plan controlled version, was what they called diagnostic. But they also recognized that things were changing and the way we dealt with clients was changing. And a lot of the original principles of organization development became incorporated into modern management practice. And so you found a lot more managers who were familiar with organization development, who were kind of using it as one aspect of how they manage the workforce. And so it wasn't any longer a business only for consultants. It broadened to include practitioners at all kinds of levels in an organization, the leadership level. Sometimes in an engineering unit, you would find individuals who were familiar with the practice, who were trying to use those principles. And the tools or techniques that we were using moved away from more formally constructed approaches to more open, spontaneous forms of dialogue, which is how the dialogic title got hung on it. So they're still very much related. And I can speak for my own practice that I actually use both mindsets when I'm doing organization development today. And sometimes that's dictated by the context. If you're working with a more formal, traditional, hierarchical organization, the diagnostic mindset sometimes is a better place to start. Whereas if you're working with a more contemporary, flatter, more participative organization, dialogic OD might be the appropriate place to start. The thing that unites both of those different mindsets is the values, the principles of organization development. And I'll quickly go through those later in this presentation. We'll get around to how these principles can be applied. And if we break into smaller groups later on, I'll give you a chance to talk about this in terms of your own work experience. The first of the principles or values is democracy, involving people, allowing people to make a choice about participating in whatever the OD intervention is going to be. Freedom of choice is an important piece of the principles of organization development, that people aren't forced to do things, that they're given a choice to decide whether they want to be involved and how much they want to be involved. And also to encourage free speech, try to create an environment that's safe enough so people can say what they're really thinking. The spirit of inquiry has always been a value of organization development, trying to figure out what's going on, going into it with an open mind, and trying to recognize that we all have biases, but trying to control those biases or suspend them long enough to truly investigate what's happening. The building of helping relationships is another principle of organization development that was strongly influenced by one of my mentors, Edgar Schein, who passed away recently in the past couple of months. Ed has always talked about the importance of relationships, but given the changes that are going on in society in the last several years, this has become a very important point that we'll talk about in greater depth later on. Humanistic values in general have always been a piece of organization development practice, and social justice and inclusiveness issues, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. The concept of teaching people how to do things for themselves versus serving as an expert where you come in and do those things for them. The generativity is an important value. And cooperation, honest, direct communication, no backstabbing, no triangulation, really dealing directly with people. So those are the values, the principles of organization development, and they apply to both the diagnostic and the dialogic mindsets. People always ask me, how do you determine if somebody's initiative is based on organization development? And my answer is, check them against the values. If the values are present in the way that the person is working or the way a manager is managing, then we're talking about organization development. So that's the overview that I think everybody needs in order to understand the rest of the presentation and its relevance to addressing some of the more recent challenges that society has been dealing with. To do that, it's important to set the context. So I'd like you to think back into the early 2020s, early 2020. And here's my perception of what went on back then. It started like a normal year. The sunrise looked kind of pretty or inviting. And then things started to darken and the conditions got extreme. And we got into a major storm of experience. And the way that manifests was in February and March of 2020, when COVID-19 became an issue that was recognized throughout the world. And all of the things that were part of that experience back then. And the impact of COVID, where suddenly people with very little advance notice found themselves working from home. Their children often sat next to them at the same table working on their school projects. That had a huge impact on what was going on in terms of the way people conceived work. In May of 2020, everyone remembers the vivid video of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and the impact that that had throughout the world in terms of the response that emerged. So those are the events that triggered my thinking about this presentation today. It's important to go back in your minds to that period of time and what was going on in your heads then, because those things really influenced how our organizations, how our institutions have responded. So here are the issues that I think organizations now have to face. This consciousness of a need to address social justice issues that haven't been addressed well. starting for most organizations with diversity, equity, and inclusion, both within the organizations as they already exist, but also across the walls of the organization in terms of future employees in the organization and people who perhaps in an organization are non-traditionally part of the workforce, and how do we include people who historically have not been involved. The mental health issues of employees have become extreme in recent years. Anxiety and depressive disorders are at an amazing high in this country. Some of the researchers say 33% of all adults are suffering from some element of anxiety or depression. Labor shortages that exist in critical occupations, nursing being an example of them. However, any of the jobs where people had to work on the front lines during the early days of COVID. Employee expectations for a new and more flexible employment relationship. After many people grew accustomed to working at home, and we recognized that it was possible to be able to do that, a lot of people prefer it and really would prefer to have the ability to continue work at home, if not full-time, at least on some part-time basis. And this one is really important. The reality that most employers simply don't understand why their employees are dissatisfied with current work situations or end up quitting. And that, of course, is something that is often written about, the Great Resignation or the Big Quit. So I want to start with that piece because I think in the context that I'm speaking today, this really is the important issue. Employers think they know why employees are leaving or are talking about leaving, but the employers are wrong. They don't get it. And this is kind of a summary of some of the research that was done by McKinsey. They've actually been expanding on it, but these are the points that they found back in late 2021 that seem to be relevant. The first column of things I'm going to show you are the issues that are more important to employees than employers believe or appreciate. The primary factor for why people leave the workforce is a belief that they are not valued by their organization. It's not money. It's not the lack of opportunity for advancement. It's not because some other organization looks like a better place to work. It's that the current organization doesn't convey to the employees that they are valued. The second most important factor from the perspective of employees is they have to feel valued by their immediate supervisor, by their manager. And if they don't, they're going to be looking for other places. The third is a sense of belonging, a sense that I'm part of something, that I'm part of a work group, that there's a social aspect to what goes on in the workplace, and I'm part of it. Work-life balance is another important issue and has been for a number of years. And the potential to advance in the organization. Part of that idea of feeling belonging in the organization. The organization values me and they want to keep me here and they're going to give me opportunities to advance. So those are issues, according to McKinsey, that are more important to employees than the employers understand or appreciate. And the last part, and perhaps another of the very important and overlooked factors, is having teammates, people who are your equals in the organization that you can trust and with whom you have caring relationships. So those are the employee issues. Here are the issues, according to McKinsey, that are less important to employees, but the employers think they're important, okay? These are less important to the employees. The first one is compensation. That I think because money is easy to count, it's a quick and dirty explanation for anything we don't like. So I think when people leave, you'll often hear managers saying, well, they were looking for more money and I simply can't match it. Well, that, according to McKinsey, isn't one of the reasons people leave, inadequate compensation. You'll often hear people saying, well, you know, the stresses are getting to be too great, or the person is not in the best health and they're trying to find a better situation. Health doesn't really enter into decisions to the extent that employers believe they do. Looking for a better job, that too is a factor that is less important to employees than the employers believe. Development opportunities. Sometimes that gets confused with this idea of potential to advance. There's a difference between knowing you have the ability to advance and actually participating in developmental opportunities. It's not that they're unimportant to employees, but not as important as employers often think. And the ability to work remotely, which is kind of interesting because in terms of work-life balance, which is important to employees, and a desire that employers are flexible, you would think, you would predict that a lot of people would like to work remotely. Well, that's not the case. In fact, when McKinsey was looking at the percentages of people who left their employers for a new employer, and there was some concern about not having flexibility and not having the ability to work at home. Only a very small percentage of those people who left ended up working remotely. That percentage was something like 14 or 17% of the people who departed actually ended up working remotely. So it's the flexibility that I believe employees are looking for, but employers probably shouldn't overrate how important working remotely is. And the last explanation you often hear from employers is, well, they were poached by another company. Somebody else was looking for them. That really is a less important thing from an employee perspective than the employers think. So those are some of the issues that I think are relevant in the workplace and that employers really need to address, and that organization development principles may help them address. The challenges that we face are complicated, and the pressures that organizations are facing, the financial capabilities of most organizations have been affected significantly in the last 2 or 3 years. So they're in an awkward position where they recognize they have difficult issues in front of them, but they don't always have the financial wherewithal to address them directly. So that requires organizations that are able to adapt. And most organizations aren't very good at adapting. That's where organization development can help. These are the types of challenges that organizations are facing. They're these very complex issues that don't have a single correct answer. They require engaging people who have a stake in the challenge, people who are going to be affected by whatever changes need to occur. They require inquiry, experimentation, they require learning. And typically, you never really solve them completely. By the time you get to what you believed was going to be the solution, there'll be other nuances, other subtleties to whatever the original problem was that make you realize you're not quite there yet. They're the sort of issues that OD is uniquely qualified to work on. So what I described earlier as dialogic organization development can be especially helpful. And this again is that split of the different mindsets that a person can bring into during organization development work. So just to set up a foundation for it and then talk about how to apply the principles. This dialogic mindset is based on several assumptions. The first is that reality and relationships are socially constructed. That in the early days of OD, there was a belief that there was kind of an objective reality that existed external to the investigation. It was there. Well, dialogic OD says it comes down to the narratives that we create about what is going on. And whether it is an objective reality or whether it is simply the conclusions that people have made based on these social constructions, they have to be dealt with. That you have to deal with both the objective and subjective parts of what's going on in society, and we collectively create those concepts of reality and relationships. Groups and organizations are continuously self-organizing, and that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're trying to apply principles of organization development, that you can exert too much control, and that may get in the way of things that would emerge. So sometimes if you buy into the idea of self-organization, sometimes management is working too hard. If it simply left the organization and the people closest to the work deal with the situation for a while, self-organizing principles would emerge. Transformational change is more emergent than planned. The example that I love about emergent change is the furniture place, IKEA, and how originally they used to build furniture in a completed form. And an employee once, in trying to load a table into his car, he was buying one of the products, realized he couldn't fit it into the car. And so he started disassembling it. And one of his friends said, you know, if we work here and we can't get the products into the car, think about the customers. They're having the same problem. Well, pretty soon they were selling unassembled pieces of furniture. And that was something that emerged at a low level in the organization. It wasn't as a result of a strategic plan or the upper level of the organization thinking about it, as much as something that just occurred. And then somebody had the wisdom to say, that's got potential. Let's consider that. So that's an important piece. Organizations try to make meaning of what's going on. They're meaning-making systems. And you can see that all the time. Anytime you hear an organization trying to give a rationale for what's going on, it's attempting to make meaning out of its current situation. If you accept that as a given, that means when you're using organization development principles, you want to create opportunities where people can talk about that, about how the meaning making is taking place and what it signals. Structure participative inquiry and engagement to increase differentiation before seeking coherence. What does that mean? It means that if you have a couple of divergent voices in a group of people who are working on a problem, don't silence them. Let them talk about that. So if you happen to be running a meeting and somebody comes back against whatever direction you are headed, and they say something like, well, I totally disagree. I think that's a crazy idea. We shouldn't be trying that. Rather than just moving forward to say to the rest of the group, are there others who feel that way here in this group? And there'll be a couple of people that say, well, maybe not quite as strongly, but I do have some doubts about it. So you would say at that point, well, why don't those of you who have some doubts about it get together in a subgroup and talk those through a little bit? And now are there people on the opposite end who really feel strongly about the direction I've been headed? Why don't you get into a group, kind of talk about the advantages that go on there? So when you do that, what's happening within those subgroups is that people in the subgroups are recognizing that there's a wide variety of perceptions about those issues, that not everybody in the subgroup agrees exactly. And in the course of that, it kind of loosens thinking. And so when you bring the subgroups back together in a large group, suddenly there is an overlap in the ideas that people have discussed at the extremes. And now you have something to work with in trying to bring about coherence. So it's important to let voices that may not be the dominant narrative to have an opportunity to talk and to expand upon what those issues are. Creating change requires changing conversations. Language matters. So again, that's from my friends Jervis Bush and Bob Marshak. So the language that matters is known as narratives. What is a narrative? It's a storyline that's shared by a group of people and explains how things are, helps people make sense of that perspective in that world, and provides a rationale that can be used for decisions and actions. Every organization has a core narrative that people use to justify decisions and their actions. But most organizations also have competing narratives, sometimes things that are simply not discussable or that people hold underground and don't share in public. And it's important to be able to get those types of narratives into the open. So the way that you go about discovering narratives is by listening carefully for the metaphors and themes in your organization. Like, we need to fix problems. We need to create new solutions. We need to become more efficient. Those are narratives that are used to justify decisions that are made in the organization. For example, if the narrative is, we're trying to be more efficient, then what you'll see in the organization are decisions that center around that type of metaphor. So you'll see people making cuts in budgets versus investing in higher priority activities and decreasing funding in lower priority activities. You'll see movements toward centralization. Those types of actions would be justified by becoming more efficient. And those may or may not be the right actions to be taken in that environment. Perhaps an investment metaphor would be a better one for that situation. So before any real change can occur in an organization, the dominant narrative has to change. And if it doesn't, the organization will continue in the path that it had previously taken. As Peter Block has said, he's another well-known OD practitioner, all transformation is linguistic. So, so I think I'm going to stop sharing. And I think we have enough time. So let me...
Right at 11:40.
Okay. So let me put you into small groups of 3 for about 5 minutes. And I'm interested in the narratives that you hear in your organizations. So what I'd like one person in your trio to do is kind of talk about the narratives that you hear in your organization. And then have the other members of the group see if they can come up with an alternative narrative. So that example I gave, if you hear a metaphor of cost efficiency and things like that in your firm, tell a little bit about the story, what's going on in your organization, what the metaphors are, and then have the other two analyze what you've told them and see if they can come up with a better metaphor. Like, well, why don't you invest in higher stake activities? Why are you just cutting costs across the whole face of the organization? All right. So I'll give you 5 minutes and I'll give you a heads up about when we're going to do that. So it looks like we need about 5 groups. And let me see if I can find that. Here it is. So give it your best bet. One person talks about their organization, what the dominant metaphor seems to be. The other members of the group think about, is there another metaphor that might be used if we were trying to transform the organization? So here we go. Welcome back. So what struck you about your conversations when you're talking about metaphors? Someone be brave.
I think it was interesting with our group that we all kind of could relate to the same narrative and kind of had that same perspective of the challenges that we were seeing. So I think that was really neat.
Mm-hmm. And was there one particular metaphor that hit the organizations?
I think what we were talking about is, because we're all kind of in the nonprofit realm, just that we are very conscious about keeping our overhead low and our administration costs low, but yet kind of also struggling with then not being able to kind of have the manpower that we need then to really meet our full potential and to really be out in the community and use our resources. So, yeah.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Pamela. Thanks for being first.
Yep.
Other things that struck you about your discussion, brief that it was?
I think this is Jose. I think one thing that stood out from our discussion is how important organizational membership, like who's in leadership, who's in the organization, how that contributes to the culture and their narrative itself. When sometimes when there's changes in membership, it can promote positive culture, or maybe it can have negative change in culture. And in terms of looking at how do we address this, sometimes we need to put a responsibility on new members to kind of help support the culture, or maybe understand it's not the right opportunity for them. So.
Great. Thanks for sharing, Jose. Anyone else? What struck you about your conversations? Yes, Dean. Oh, you're muted.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, conversation I had, it was Miss Olson, I believe, that I was partnered with, is a big issue we both had in our organizations, and it's two completely different things, is the staffing, and they'll say, well, we need more staff to complete this, and it's productivity is the big issue. And so you may give them more staff, and then it's still not getting done. And it's like, well, no, what's the issue? We gave you what you asked for. And one thing that really helped in our organization is we started investing into our team members' personal development, which it's expensive to do that, and it's a big investment. But developing into helping your team members develop personally and invest in that personal development give them opportunities to develop themselves, they become knit as a team, and we saw the productivity go way up. And so that was a big help. Like I say, it is an investment on your team, but that was something that helped us.
Great. Thanks, Dean. Thank you. So I think in wrapping up my contributions, I think your contributions right now were just great. But I think in terms of applying the principles of organization development to deal with some of these adaptive challenges, there are a few ideas that are worth considering. First, learn in general. Learn how to listen versus tell. The old model of the top-down approach to leadership is outdated, and it's not very effective in this work environment. So if I can put it into a sentence, I think that's it for managers and leaders in organizations. Learn how to listen versus tell people. Learn how to build work relationships with your employees in the organization. Years and years ago, when I started my management career, people said, don't you do that. Keep your social distance from the people who work for you in the organization. That was actually an explicit message that new managers were given back then. But today, it's not necessarily about becoming close personal friends, but it's becoming knowledgeable about what motivates people who you work with in the organization. What are the things that are important to them? And consider them in a somewhat broader way than simply somebody who's working at the organization. This is somebody I want to have a strong working relationship with, more than being transactional, I guess is what I'm saying. Learn to be transparent. Tell people what's going on in your head, or they're going to make up a story about what's going on in your head, and you might as well control that. And being transparent is really important. And that's true not only for managers and supervisors, but for all of us in an organization, to try to be clear. Involve people who are closest to the work in defining, planning, and implementing the changes. That a lot of times senior leadership in an organization comes up with a solution that they think will work, and then it becomes the role of the employees and the staff members to implement that. A better approach is to involve the people closest to where the change is going to occur in the planning, in the thinking that goes on in advance. And they will, as a result of that, also be more understanding of why the change is necessary and probably more engaged with the whole process. The last point is, I think, try to establish a sense of community in the organization if you can do that. And that really comes down to trying to identify those factors that McKinsey talked about in their study and consciously work toward addressing them. So there are a lot of ways that you can go about doing that, creating opportunities for people to get to know each other better, creating social opportunities, whatever it takes to create that sense of I belong to this organization. And I have colleagues and people I consider work friends who support me, and I support them in turn. So I think that's what I have to say about the principles of organization development and how they can be used to deal with some of the challenges that we face in the workplace. And I believe that gives us about 5 minutes if you have questions or additional comments that you'd like to make.
Thank you so much, Bob. Yeah, we'll open it up for questions. If you have any, please feel free to pop on audio, or if you're more comfortable, we can submit it in the chat and we can read it for you.
Don't be bashful.
Hey, Bob, I just wanted to comment when you had the two lists of what employees deemed valuable and what employers thought that employees deemed valuable. It was interesting that employees had the work-life balance and then employers thought about the working remotely. And I kind of looking at that, I thought that those are really two different issues, right? Because just because you're working remote doesn't mean you have work-life balance. And I actually found when I work remote, I work a lot more, probably more than I should. Especially during like when the pandemic was happening. I mean, I was on my email at 6 a.m. I was on at midnight versus when I'm in the office, you know, you're obviously restricted to those hours and the balance is just better. So I thought that was an interesting point that you brought up.
Yeah, thanks, Pamela. Yeah, I saw as you were speaking, I saw a lot of heads nodding from others who I'm sure were working at home and working a much longer workday. Other questions or comments?
Thank you. This is Karin. I'm at Safe Haven, and I was just struck, honestly, in your wrap up here. Those 5 points are just like so simple and so basic and really like not rocket science, you know, listening, you know, building community, being transparent. It's like we should all be able to do these things. And then because of the narratives and the systems and all the history and sometimes baggage, you know, it doesn't always happen as consistently or as cleanly as it should, but it really boils down to some pretty simple suggestions. So thanks for that too.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I agree. They are simple things to do and well within the grasp of most employers. And there's very little expense involved in any of those things. And I think there was something in the chat. Let me see. Intrigued about the idea of moving towards relational relationships versus transactional. Yeah, I think that's where it's at going forward in organizations, that the old way of doing things, the old transactional relationships that don't acknowledge the humanness of the people involved is a big mistake. And years ago, when people were entering management, sometimes they were given a message to try to keep those things separate. But in today's society, I don't see how that's going to work. So do your best.
Bob, I have a question.
Yep.
What's a time frame that you should expect for culture change to happen? Is there a window?
Well, that's an entirely different topic. I'd love to talk about it. You can't go direct. I'll try to be concise. It is impossible to go directly at changing a culture. That's not how it occurs. So we all have kind of aspirational cultures that we'd like to create, but to believe that we can create them directly isn't the way a culture forms. Cultures are learned. And the way that they're learned is by making behavior changes, which we can make very quickly. If the behavior changes have a positive impact and they become widely known among members in the organization as the reason that things have improved, eventually they will become embedded in the culture. So that's the way you go about changing the culture. And the beauty of that is you can demand behavioral changes. One example that I think of, in some healthcare organizations, there was a time when physicians would, when frustrated, yell at nurses or others who weren't complying with whatever they thought was necessary. Well, that's something you can control immediately. If you happen to be the director of the healthcare organization, you simply tell the physicians that they can't yell at people. And if they continue to do that, they'll have to work somewhere else, you know. And if that in turn improves things, when the yelling stops, if the quality of care goes up, if the satisfaction with the work environment goes up, then turnover rates will drop down, complaints will drop down, if people are more satisfied who work in the organization, it's likely that the patients will realize that also, and they'll probably be more satisfied. So if it works and everybody recognizes that the no shouting rule is the reason, soon that will be part of the culture. We don't shout at people here. We don't do that. So quick lesson on culture. I'd love to talk about that someday, though, in more depth.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. We're right at noon. So I think what we're going to do is we'll close it out. But then if you want to hang out for another minute or two in case anyone else has additional questions, that would be fantastic. So Bob, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today. We appreciate the College of St. Scholastica's sponsorship of the series. And thank you all for joining us today. We did record the session, so I'll be sending that out within the next day or two. If you wanted to go back and rewatch it or share it with any of your colleagues, you're more than welcome to do so. But I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Drive safe on the roads if you're out there. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.